in Egypt, as you probably already gathered from the chapter if you read it. And again, get the book. It's important because I'm not going to cover everything in the chapters. I'm going to pretty much assume that you've done the reading before you come to class for every time we come to class, including today, okay? The idea here is for us to use Egypt as an example at the outset of the kind of, the society, a civilization that is preoccupied with this idea of life and death, but in a different way, and here's the key, than the Greeks were, okay? As we'll see, and let me just make a very sharp generalization at the outset, and that you probably already gathered from the chapter, and that is that whereas the ancient Egyptians, as far as we can tell, looked at death in such a way that it was an opportunity to be able to live in the afterlife in a way that was a lot more advantageous than living in this world, the ancient Greeks were the opposite. The ancient Greeks believed in, and I'm talking about orthodox belief here, okay? There were some who didn't and all that, just like there are, throughout the ages. But the kind of the state religious way of looking at things was, for the ancient Greeks, that death, even though there's an afterlife, sucked. Nothing good about it. Don't give me that crap about the afterlife. It sucks. And there's a really important passage in the Iliad where that topic comes up very strongly. So keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, there's among other evidence, at least literary evidence, mythological evidence in ancient Greece, this idea that no matter how much power you have in the underworld, okay, and I'll give you a hint, it's Achilles and the power that he has once he dies and goes in the underworld, it still sucks, 100%, nothing good about it. Okay, now the best symbol for that, for the Greeks, is Hades. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about him as we move on in the semester. But he's the underworld god. And by the way, there's no place called Hades. So if you ever hear they went to Hades, they mean that Hades' house, Hades' pad. All right, that's where they went. It's Hades is a deity. So Hades, once he gets the short end of the stick and has to be the king of the gods in the underworld, as we'll see. So this is just jumping ahead. It will be nothing but terrible, nothing but dark, nothing but pessimistic about Hades. No one wants anything to do with him. You will notice if you Google images of Hades, you're not going to find them. Isn't that weird? There just aren't images in the ancient world. Then later on, there are people who try to come up with their own creative ways of representing him. But there was a collective stigma attached to the very idea of representing the god of the underworld visually in ancient Greece. Now, how does that compare with the Egyptians? Exact opposite. And if you read chapter 1 of the book, you know that at the end of it, when Osiris becomes the god of the underworld, that's almost a promotion. But at the very least, it's just as good as what he was before that, the sun god. Okay? When he, for reasons that are clear in the story, and that we may or may not get to today, but I'll leave it up to you to read that chapter, Osiris is assigned to the underworld, and that is by no means a demotion. Whereas Hades, being the god of the underworld in Greece, that's just about saying you're this, the lowest thing you can possibly be. Okay? So that's a difference between the ancient Egyptian conception of death and the afterlife, and its counterpart in Greece that has to really be paid attention to. Once we get into the Greek stories, we're going to see that that's a leitmotif throughout all of them. Okay? All right, so what I want to do as far as Egypt goes is give you a kind of intro to chapter 1. I'm not going to go through the Heliopolis creation myth that I'm having you guys read. That I'll leave up to you to read, and it will be important for you to know the details of it. But, I'm not going to always just, do nothing but go through the stories that are in each of the chapters. In this case, I want to kind of give you some background about ancient Egypt in a very selective way, in a kind of ideological way, in the sense of understanding, what we just talked about, this idea of where the ancient Egyptian conception of the afterlife being a place for there to be, if you play your cards right, enjoyment, rather than it being such a horrible thing, as we'll see when we get to Greece. So we start out with the very idea of Egypt in our time and in the past, throughout the ages, being referred to as the gift of the Nile. Why is that? Because there is nothing more conspicuous, just like the ocean, the mountains, and the sky in Greece. Nothing more conspicuous about Egypt when it comes to both kind of the general idea you have of it, and the more practical aspects of what is most important about Egypt when it comes to agriculture and the sustenance of life, etc., than the Nile. Okay? So the Nile, as you probably all know, annually overflows its banks, and because of it, it's able to be a highly navigable agricultural paradise. I mean, it's amazing the way that the Nile works along with the people who, as long as they cultivate the crops properly, are able to live on along the Nile and to enjoy their lives there. So that is the main criterion for where the first civilizations, the ancient civilizations, sprung up. It's around water. Okay, water is life-sustaining. There was already air everywhere, so we're covered with air. But now water. Where's the water? Okay? And so the Nile is the most famous example of a highly beneficial relationship to water for the sustenance of life, etc. When we get to Mesopotamia next time, you'll see that it's a little more complicated. And supposedly, the stories that were told in Mesopotamia reflected a greater insecurity about the ability to sustain a society, a civilization, by using their equivalent to the Nile, which is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Because there's a blending of salt water and fresh water. It's a lot less predictable when it overflows the banks, and sometimes it doesn't, and when it doesn't, there's insecurity about being able to keep on living, and you have to have surplus, and things get a lot more complicated. In Egypt, it's a lot more predictable, and so you're able, among other things, to generalize about this idea of things are simple. The Nile equals life, and then guess what equals death? Now we're getting to a kind of binary mindset here. From Egypt and from Mesopotamia, from China and from India and Mesoamerica, the very first civilizations perpetuated this very idea of opposites in a way that we must attend to, because we do it too in our world, and quite often it leads to a lot of bad stuff, right? And so the most obvious binary foundation for ancient Egypt is this idea of the Nile versus what? Desert. Okay, so the desert is the opposite of the Nile in the sense that the Nile is what provides us with the water we need to irrigate crops in order to have civilizations to be able to store up food and to have palaces, and then it goes on. Then you get political, and the idea is who owns the palaces and how big are the walls to keep out who, and to differentiate between those in power and not in power and all that kind of stuff. But it all begins with water. Right? It begins with water and agriculture. Right? And then from all that spring, if you didn't have all that, you wouldn't have the ability to sustain life, and there you wouldn't have all the other problems that come from economy and politics and all that kind of stuff. So, from the very beginning in Egypt, okay, and China has their equivalent, Mesopotamia, we'll talk about next time, has their equivalent, but for Egypt, it's very straightforward. There's water, and then there is a lack of water. Water is life, desert is death. Okay? The very reason why the Greeks themselves were able to be influenced by the binary way of looking at the world, and that's another leitmotif that will crop up throughout the whole semester and all the myths that we look at in Greece. This good, bad, up, down, God, not God, divine, not divine, etc. It's due to this one guy in Greece in the 5th century BC, Herodotus, who you might have heard of, that the Greeks were introduced to the Egyptians. And he's often referred to as the father of history, because he was the first to make it clear that he was writing what we would today call kind of pseudo-history, more ethnography than anything else, in order to preserve the things that occurred that were most important for posterity, as opposed to letting them disappear. Okay? The memory of things from the past. And so, in book 2 of his histories, which is pretty much chapter 2 of his histories, he talks about his travels to, kind of like Marco Polo in the Middle Ages. He was really a kind of pioneer when it comes to traveling around at least the known world in the 5th century BC, which, by the way, I'm throwing out 5th century BC right now achronologically in order to make the connection between Greece and Egypt, but don't worry, we're going to slowly work up to 5th century. That'll mean a lot more to you if you don't already know what we're talking about. But just for now, just realize there's a guy in Greece in the 5th century, which is pretty much the cultural epicenter of ancient Greece, who wrote about the known world all over the place, Babylon, Egypt. And what he said about Egypt is pretty interesting. And that is, that for the most part his take on Egypt was, kind of patronizingly, they do everything the exact opposite as the Greeks. Okay, so everything's opposite. And so he comes up with a lot of cultural things that you would expect to find maybe in anthropological treatises that the Egyptians do differently and opposite, to the extent to where some believe that he kind of exaggerates. But the key here is for us to realize that it's because of him that the Greeks started thinking of Egypt as a kind of alternate way of dealing with the kinds of questions that arise, especially in the context of creating myths to explain the world. All right, so kind of predictably, based on what I've said so far, Egypt was 100% theocracy in the sense that there was no separation between what we would today call church and state, between temple and state. It was all one. And as you'll see, that's pretty much the case in the West as well. And very importantly, for the Egyptians, just like with the Greeks, as you'll see, and the Romans, there wasn't one God. It wasn't monotheistic, but rather polytheistic. There were lots and lots of gods, mainly at first, for a practical reason, to explain different types of natural phenomena. You know, so there's a thunder god, i.e. Zeus, or if you want to even go to later on the Norse stuff, you have their equivalent, Thor, etc. Lots of different gods, and usually there is one in charge of the others, and it kind of differs in Egypt. In the story that we dealt with for today, Heliopolis' creation myth, it changes. It starts with Osiris. Then when he gets pretty much defeated by Seth, then Horus becomes the new king of the gods. Whereas in Greece, once Zeus, as we'll see, becomes the head god, he stays the head god. Okay? Now, we can go deeper than that, though. We're going to, and the book does too. Because is it really true that Zeus ends up being the most important of the gods? I vote for Apollo, to give you kind of a spoiler. But we'll see what you guys think. Okay? It's good to think these things through instead of just taking them from the primers and say, okay, Zeus is the king of the gods. Really? All right, who says? And how long do they keep saying it? There's a good argument that Apollo, or even Athena, becomes the main god. But that comes later. The pharaoh was not only considered to be the kind of equivalent of the king of the Egyptians, and not only the equivalent of the chief religious leader of the Egyptians, but actually as a god himself, and in particular the sun god. The sun god is the one that ends up being the head god in Egypt. Now, is that the case in Greece? And if so, why not? I'm not even going to answer it yet, but just think about that. The importance of the pyramids can't be underestimated. And if you've done the reading for today, you know that the Heliopolis creation myth is by far the most important of the creation myths in ancient Egypt. It all begins out of nowhere with Nun, which is pretty much this giant ocean that covers everything, and that's the very beginning of the universe. And then what's called the Benben, kind of a cute name, comes up from, emerges from the endless sea, and that becomes the one patch of land, the symbolic patch of land from which everything else grows. Okay? And so on that patch of land, out of nowhere, comes Osiris, okay, the sun god. And so right away, you have, spoiler, the first of the four elements, okay, because this idea of the universe consisting of elements, fire, water, air, and earth, that comes right from Egypt. It's very famous in Greece, especially with the first philosophers of Greece. They have the same way of trying to explain the universe into its different components, the different elements. But in Egypt, you have the same thing. So at the very beginning, the story you guys read for today, and if you haven't already, you will, Osiris represents the sun god and thereby the element of fire. And then from that comes the other four elements. So you have a kind of explanation of where things come from. And then once they're established, then you have a kind of drama that occurs based on those elements that is supposed to, as far as we can tell, represent the types of natural phenomena that we try to understand now, anachronistically, if we're going to try to impose it on the Egyptians, in science. So it's kind of a proto-scientific way of trying to come to terms with the universe. And so the pyramids, as far as we know, were what this notion of the Benben at the very beginning of the universe, emerging from the water, the model for the Benben, this idea of what? What's at the very beginning of the universe, besides the endless ocean? This mound of earth that is structured very conspicuously as a pyramid. Okay? So what is a pyramid? Pyramid's a tomb in which who? The pharaoh lives, in order to properly make sure that he lives on the right way in the afterlife. So you're already getting a kind of interesting association there. You have the main myth that is spread all over the place, all over the ancient world, but especially all over Egypt, the Heliopolis creation myth, and you have this idea of at the very beginning of the universe comes what? Comes this thing that you associate with the pyramid, which itself is associated with the one and only human being / God who gets to live inside of that in order to live on in the afterlife in a way that no one else is able to. So let's deal with that idea. You have this Ben, at the very beginning of the universe that represents the pyramid, the place where the one person out of all of Egypt gets to live in the afterlife after having been mummified, properly prepared for the afterlife. Okay? Then you have texts written in hieroglyphics inside of these pyramids, all over the walls, chiseled extremely, subtly, and, look at that. This is by chisel, man. This is with a little, with a stylus and a chisel. And we're talking about, get ready, not hundreds, not thousands, but millions of these characters, which are, fairly good size, covering the many, many walls within a pyramid. I don't know if you knew how elaborate these things are. So you have millions of these characters all over the walls inside of a pyramid. And the question is, what the heck does it say? Does anyone know? First of all, we're not supposed to know. First of all, this is supposed to remain shut for eternity in order for the Pharaoh to go on into the afterlife in the way that he's supposed to. But that didn't happen due to archaeology, right? Which isn't often talked about, the ethical aspects of it all. And I always get creeps whenever I go to crypts, in museums. I'm like, maybe not. And I kind of look at a distance. It's a little, this idea that, they took it very seriously. What are these millions and millions of characters inside of a pyramid devoted to? First of all, a story. And second of all, what story? The story of how the Pharaoh is supposed to conduct himself and the retainers who he had killed along with him. Before he died, he had his retainers in our world be killed in order to be buried with him, so that in the afterlife they're with him still. It's the story of what they need to do, what the Pharaoh especially needs to do, the instructions he needs to obey in order for his soul to live on in the most proper way in the afterlife. Now here's the real punchline. These millions and millions of characters on the wall are not only not intended to be seen by us who live thousands of years later, and this should blow your mind, but by no one at the time of the Pharaoh living as well, other than the Pharaoh himself, who is dead. So whoever it is, and it's probably slaves, who are most responsible for creating these interiors, this is meant to be sealed off forever, and you have thousands and thousands of characters that no one is intended to see other than the Pharaoh, who is dead. Does that give you some idea about the power of this idea of how deeply the ancient Egyptians apparently believed in this afterlife, or at least insisted upon the slaves who made these things to make it possible for the Pharaoh to move on into the afterlife in the proper way? Okay, so there's a real deep sense of belief here about how important it is for this to occur in a way that you're not going to see in Greece. Okay? In Greece, the focus is not on doing everything possible in order to make the afterlife transition as beneficial as possible, but rather what? Maximizing the hell out of how much meaning you find in this world. Because after you die, it just effing sucks. That's the vibe you're going to get when you get to Greece. None of this idea of, okay, let's put everything into this idea of the afterlife and make that be our focus. And obviously, with monotheistic religions in our times, there's a connection there as well, this idea of the afterlife and all that. So it's important for us to understand where Egypt's coming from when it comes to all this, because when we get to Greece, we're going to see a completely different mood. And when we talk about gods in Greece, it might seem kind of weird at first, but the gods in Greece, unlike the gods in Egypt, unlike the gods in Mesopotamia, although a little to a lesser degree in Mesopotamia, as we'll see next time, the gods in Greece tend to be what is called anthropomorphic, a lot more than the gods in Egypt. What does that mean? It means patterned on human beings. Okay, so anthropos means human being. Doesn't mean man. So anthropology means the study of humans. And morphic just means the shape. Okay, so anthropomorphic means shaped after, patterned on human beings. So when we get to unlike Osiris and Horus and all them, who are patterned more on animals and other kind of natural things, okay, the gods of Greece and Rome, especially Greece, are going to be patterned on human beings themselves, anthropomorphic, okay? And so what that means is, not only does Zeus have a beard, not only does he look very easily recognizable as a human being, the behavior of the ancient Greek gods and goddesses might surprise you when it comes to how human they are, in the sense of exhibiting what we would today call kind of limitations, right? That you wouldn't expect beings that were designated as gods and goddesses to have, you know. And so, for example, Zeus constantly going behind Hera's back and trying to have sex with just about anyone he can. Okay, it goes on. And Hera being pissed off at him all the time. And there's this interesting kind of reality show going on between Zeus and Hera all the time. And lots of stories centering on it. And then Aphrodite and her affairs with Ares, the bad boy, you know, the kind of archetype for the bad boy. All right, married to Hephaestus, the craftsman god, but more importantly, the lame god, the god who is, quote, ugliest, unquote, of all of the gods, to the extent to where Hera, once he was born, threw him out of Olympus, hoping he would not die, because gods don't die, but be completely disfigured so he could never come back to Olympus after he'd been born, so ugly. And then he gets back at her because he's the craftsman god, and he does that kind of thing. Okay, so we're talking about a whole other kind of vibe, or a whole other aura about the deities in Greece that segues nicely into their conception of heroes. This very idea of preparing people for the afterlife so that they have a favorable living after they die starts out with the pharaoh and the pyramid modeled on the Bin Ben, or vice versa. No one knows for sure. Okay, the very beginning of the universe, the most primordial moment at the beginning of the creation myth, the most important one of Egypt. But then it expands. So first you have the giant pyramids, and we'll talk about how giant they are in a second. It blows your mind how big they are. But then you have other forms of preparing people for the afterlife according to ancient Egyptian orthodoxy. Starts with pyramids, and then it gets to coffins. And so once you move on about 500 years into the future, so starting around 2500 BC, you get the pyramids, and then 1,000 or 500 years or so later, you start getting a more democratized approach to this idea of preparing people for the afterlife. And then not only the pharaoh and his retainers and his family get to live on in the afterlife, but then a lot of the kind of aristocrats of Egyptian society get to as well, on a much more modest level. Instead of there being giant pyramids built for them, now there are mini tombs, okay, or coffins. And inside of those coffins, you have the same idea. It's filled with instructions for the afterlife. So apparently there was this overarching belief that what was the information provided in these chambers was going to assure people of living on into the future in a beneficial way. There are lots and lots of stories around Egypt devoted to this idea of where the world came from, and, you know, kind of the overall configuration of how everything works, who's in power and why, all over Egypt. The one that we look at in chapter 1 is called the Heliopolis creation myth because it comes from one place called Heliopolis. But there are others. All of them have the sun god as the main god. But in the case of Memphis, for example, below Saqqara, where the first pyramid comes from, Giza, where the biggest and most famous ones come from, etc. In Memphis, you have a creation story about Ptah, P-T-A-H, who is the craftsman god within the pantheon of ancient Egypt. Okay, so in other words, the equivalent of Hephaestus. So I'm making a comparison here. Just as we talked about ancient Egypt and the different notion of the afterlife and different notion of death, and how when Osiris is appointed the god of the underworld, it's by no means a demotion, whereas for the Greeks, Hades being the god of the underworld is a absolutely terrible thing. He has no friends. He has to kidnap his wife in order for her to live down there, and even then she only lives down there for one season, as we'll see. We're going to get to that myth. Just as we have that big distinction between Egypt and Greece, so when it comes to this idea of work, the idea of a craftsman, to the extent of even having a god that is a craftsman god, is much different in Egypt than it is in Greece. In Egypt, you have Ptah, who is so important and so kind of unequivocally seen as an important and meant to be taken seriously god, that he even is in this very important, not as important as Heliopolis, but very important creation myth, pretty much the beginner of it all. He blows out air, and from the air that he blows out, the universe springs up, okay, originates, okay? So that's one way of, paying respect to a god, is you have him be kind of the equivalent of Hephaestus in Greece. But when you get to Greece, as we'll see, the idea of a craftsman god, in the case of who we already mentioned, Hephaestus, the kind of ironically appointed husband of Aphrodite, the most beautiful of the goddesses. He's the most ugly. He's the most disfigured. You have that symbolism of Hephaestus, the equivalent of Ptah in Greece, being someone who is ridiculed by the rest of the Olympians and looked down upon. Why? Because it reflects the idea in ancient Greece throughout all of its history. This even goes on into the later period, in the Hellenistic period. This idea that if you are someone who has to work for a living, especially with your hands, but if you have to work for someone else in order to put food on the table in ancient Greece, that is the lowest of the low, one step up from slaves, who were the very lowest because slaves tended to be captured in war, and they were, in any civilization, they're the least fortunate, obviously, to say the least. Okay? But one step up from that, maybe, was any kind of craftsman, any kind of person who worked for a living, including poets, by the way. Okay? When we get to Greece, we'll talk about Homer and the paradox of the Homeric homes pretty much being beyond the Bible of the Greeks, because it's both secular and religious. But by the same token, as far as we know, when a poet such as Homer was living in ancient Greece, he was far from considered anything like the kind of celebrity that poets and musicians and movie stars are in our society. The equivalent of whoever today is number 1 or number 2 or number 3 on the Billboard charts was who, you guys? There's only one answer to it. 100%. Military. Okay? 100%. That was it. Now, when you get to Rome, you start talking about gladiators kind of getting the cachet of kind of a rock star. Okay? And it's true. Ways that we'll kind of get to later in the semester. Because why? Because in the earliest period of Greek history, leading all up into the last, the Hellenistic period, and even then, you didn't have guns, you didn't have bombs, you didn't have airplanes, what did you have? You had spears, swords, and shields. And guess what? They were ridiculously expensive. Okay? They were the most expensive things other than land. Okay? And we'll talk about this later. But the point is, those who have the weapons have, as crazy as it sounds, the power. They're the ones that the leaders depend on to protect them behind their walls, the walls of their palaces. Okay? And so it makes sense that those with that kind of power would be the ones that had most importance in society. And that extends to the idea of, the best warriors, the ones that the people depended on most to protect them, and to, the ones that fought best and strategized best in the wars against foreign enemies, or even within Hellas, within Greece. They were the ones who were looked up to more than anyone else. You had zero. We need to really understand this. In Greece and in Rome, you had zero notion that those who were most creative, what we would today call creative, when it comes to art, when it comes to music, when it comes to whatever, they were by no means, rock stars. They were by no means anything other than entertainers, anything other than hired hands. And it just so happens that a lot of what they created measures up to the best art that we could ever imagine. Why? it's kind of complicated. Why wasn't it just a bunch of frivolous crap? It became that as time went on further in say, Greek history. The later it got, the more frivolous things became artistically. On one branch. And the other branches, it became a lot more difficult and complex and according to some, even better. So there was this kind of highly intellectualized art that emerged and versus the more like reality TV stuff. Okay? But before that, you had guys like Homer, you had the Greek tragedians, etc., and they were considered to be entertainers not because they were valued to be the leaders of culture the way they are in our time. Justin Bieber has more followers on Twitter, I think, than anyone in the world, right? The equivalent to that would be obviously a general in a war. In the, say, the Persian Wars, he would be the guy with 20 or 50 million followers or whatever. Okay, whole other way of looking at things. Let me just lead you to the doorstep of reading chapter 1 yourself, or reviewing it if you already have. And that is the biggest reason why I had you, other than what we talked about already, learn about the Heliopolis creation myth in Egypt, is to understand that the use put to it by Narmer, by most accounts the first of the pharaohs of Egypt. Some say this dude, the Scorpion King, was different than him and may have been the very first, or maybe it was the same guy. There's still debate about it. But let's just, for the sake of at least what the Greeks believed, say that Narmer was the first of the Egyptian pharaohs. And the use that he put to the Heliopolis creation myth was no other than what we have to call propagandistic. It's a use of myth for a political purpose. And that political purpose is to advocate the unification of North and South Egypt. Okay? There were external enemies. Okay, especially in the east, or the northeast of Egypt, in Mesopotamia. And they needed to, as far as Narmer was concerned, it wasn't enough for one part of Egypt to be separate from another when it came to the threat of external foes and wars that were constantly engaged in. So he made use of this myth in order to advocate the unification of North and South. And how did he do it? Symbolically. Okay, so there are various characters in this myth that I'll leave it up to you to read about. I'm not going to go through every stage of the myth, but I do in chapter 1. But the key here is that there are two main characters to this myth, and they represent, or I should say they're identical, just so happens, to the gods who are worshipped, on the one hand, in his own settlement, and on the other hand, the settlement that he is advocating unifies with his settlement. So what do you do? How do you do that? How do you, first of all, establish that you are the guy who gets to call the shots, and second of all, that the guy who doesn't get to call the shots, the pharaoh of Nagata in this case, other settlement, follows the dictates of this one guy, Narmer, and agrees to unify. How do you do it? What you do is you make it clear in this myth that has been propagated all over Egypt that the place that Narmer rules worships the god who pretty much won the battle in the story. Okay? So as you'll see, Horus becomes the champion of the Heliopolis creation myth. And he badly defeats this guy Seth, who was the one that the place that he wants to get to unify with his settlement, but also pretty much the rest of Egypt, that they worshipped. Okay, so you have these two gods, and you have these two places, and one place worships one god, the other worships the other, and you have this story that, yeah, it goes all the way back to the beginning of the universe and tells where it all came from, but then it leads up to the one god, Horus, overcoming the god of this other place in a very symbolic way that, as far as we can tell, straight out said, hey guys, just like in this story, it's time for you guys to do what Seth did in the story, and that is to just say, okay, you're kind of the equivalent of Horus. Okay, you, Narmer, are the one that we are going to obey in that respect. And at the very last page of the chapter, you see this thing called the Narmer palette, which was really a palette. It was a cosmetic tablet where you put some kind of eyeshadow or something in the middle of it, and it represented this idea Narmer at home, being the champion at home, worshiping Horus, and then Narmer in foreign places, far away, represented by kind of the extreme long shot, if you want to get cinematic about it. Close up is him at home, and the extreme long shot on the back of it is everywhere else. The idea being that this is a kind of propagandistic complement to the story, that Narmer is the leader of all of Egypt, not just at home, but also foreignly as well. Okay? And so just take a look at that chapter and get a sense of how important that story is to Narmer and to Egypt. Because when we get to Greece, you're going to see, especially when we get to the hero Theseus, who is the third of the pre-Homeric heroes that we'll be dealing with, that the Greeks employ a myth about Minos, the first king of Minoan civilization, the very first civilization of Greece, in a very similar propagandistic way. Okay, so this Heliopolis creation myth provides a kind of foreshadowing for us of what the Greeks themselves would do when they employ their myths in a propagandistic way. Now, that's not to say that myth is nothing but propaganda, but it is to say that one use of myth is propagandistic. In other words, what does that mean? In order, among other things, to get people to do what you want them to do, in order to feel as though it's the right thing to do, as opposed to forcing them to do it. The idea is that you kind of make sense to them about it being the right thing to do, so there's less of a chance of revolution, less of a chance of, any kind of undesirable results. Because that's all you had in the ancient world. You didn't have the internet, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have Twitter, you didn't have any way to affect change technologically other than to spread stories at the very beginning. But then, as we'll see when we get to 5th century Athens, around the time of Herodotus, the father of history, that there were other means of doing so, and I hinted at it last time, this idea of the advent of theater, and the idea of putting everybody from a given polis, from a given city-state in one place, and having the power, and that's exactly what it is, as the leader of the people, to stand in the middle of that place and to talk to 13,000 people at once in a city of only 100,000 citizens. So just a few performances, and you've said the same thing, whatever it happens to be, to everybody, and in a way that you weren't able to do before the advent of theater. But before that, what did you have? You had stories that were spread around, and look at how much more powerful it is to symbolize what Narmer wanted the rest of Egypt to do through a story than if he had done nothing but said, "I am Narmer, and I advise all of you to get together against any future common foes," and all that, in a more straightforward and literalistic way. That wouldn't have had the effect that the myth and the propagandistic use of it had around Egypt. Okay, so that's the gist of chapter 1. When we get to chapter 2, we're not going to be dealing as much with gods as heroes, and we're not going to be dealing with Egypt, but rather with Mesopotamia, the other main ancient civilization that influenced and was a big trading partner with Greece. Okay, so that's why we're, like I said, leaving out China and India in this class, and Mesoamerica, because Egypt and Mesopotamia were the most important influences on Greece. But next time we're going to be looking at a story about a guy named Gilgamesh, who is a hero who very conspicuously represents the main archetype for the ancient Greek conception of the hero.